It's particularly timely, though, because if you notice after Super Tuesday, the Google search spikes after Tuesday night. The line, "How can I move to Canada?" was the most popular phrase. So I wonder, did you bring any real estate guides or anything like that with you? I don't want to ask you anything undiplomatic. He's a civil servant, but there probably are some people interested on both sides of the political ideology. Anyway, with that, I want to welcome Dr. Roy Norton.
Thank you, Mr. Jensen.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I used to do this job in Detroit, Canada's Consul General in Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. And before the last election in 2012, particularly in Michigan, and particularly in West Michigan, I had both Democrats and Republicans coming up to me saying, if the election goes the wrong way, from their point of view, they wanted to talk to me about moving to Canada, which I thought was instructive or revealing of a number of things. First off, you have really right-wing Republicans and really left-wing Democrats apparently thinking that Canada is safe refuge for either one. We're clearly a tableau that isn't definitively painted. Secondly, nobody followed up. So who knows whether this surge in Google searches will mean anything at the end of the day or not. I did alert my government that we used to have an immigration office at our consulate, which we closed down a few years ago, but I did suggest to them a number of months ago that they may have to invest resources in reopening it in the event of, and who knows, the Google searches suggest that maybe we'll be right. Thank you for all of you for coming. This is an opportunity that I've been looking forward to for a while. Thank you for inviting me. I've got a presentation which I'll talk to and probably digress from at certain points, and then we'll leave half the time for questions. My country's big, bigger slightly than the United States. With a 5,500-mile border, as every American learned in last week's debate, a border that apparently is too long to build a wall on, and that's fine. We may or may not get to a video at the end that substantiates that Canadians actually are prepared to pay for bridges to the United States, but we don't pay for walls. So there's only 35 million of us, smaller slightly than the population of California. We can't get close enough to you. We just love you. So 85% of us live 100 miles from the US border. It's also our sun belt, in a sense, so that helps explain why we tend to huddle so close to the United States. The consulate that I work in, Canada's got 12 consulates in the United States. That's how seriously we take you. And there are about 22 people that work with me in my office. We do business, as in we try to facilitate business connections between Canadian companies and US companies, supply chain relationships, research and development partnerships, innovation partnerships. We try to attract investment to Canada, just as your U.S. commercial service officers based in Canada try to attract Canadian investment here. Right now, Canada's on sale in the sense that our dollar is worth only about 70 cents United States. So anybody wanting to invest in Canada, or for that matter, travel as a tourist, gets great value for your investment. We focus on certain sectors. I do this in 3 states, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Missouri. And of course, we have an embassy in Washington where I've served twice as well. You've got 3 different presidents there saying great things about the relationship. It truly is a special relationship, probably more special to us because of our fixation with the United States than it is necessarily with you. Although I think that Americans, you tell me, have a generally positive attitude towards Canada. We're probably, there you go. we're probably seen as, at worst benign, and maybe at best, reliable friends and allies, and as I'll reveal, we're your best customers by a long shot, as you are for us. It's really a symbiotic and constructive relationship. This is a map, or two maps rather, showing Canada's Parliament after the 2011 election. Blue is Conservative, orange is New Democrat, our social democratic party, red is Liberal. You'll see that in 2011 there weren't very many Liberals. The Liberals had their historic worst election with only 35 seats. They'd never done nearly as poorly. This is the 2015 version. We had an election on the 19th of October, and you see much more red. The Liberals went from a poor third to a comfortable first, and these maps don't really do justice because the Toronto is down here, Montreal is down here, i.e. big population concentrations don't show up very well on the map. The Liberals swept both of those cities. Indeed, they swept most of southern Ontario, which is the mother lode in terms of seats. The new Prime Minister, top left, Justin Trudeau, 44 years of age. He turned 44 on Christmas Day. Born in Canada's version of the White House and lived there for the first 13 years of his life, but for 9 months of a government led by Joe Clark, Progressive Conservative Prime Minister. Stéphane Dion, our Foreign Minister, previous leader of the Liberal Party for a couple of years, 2006 to 8, was Environment Minister in the previous Liberal government from 4 to 6, and is now our Foreign Minister. Chrystia Freeland is our Trade Minister, equivalent to USTR. She's a internationally renowned, I don't think I'm exaggerating her credentials, journalist, economics, financial journalist, worked for Reuters, Thomson, Financial Times. Bill Morneau, an entrepreneur in downtown Toronto who created a services company, went from 0 to 3,000 people, is our finance minister, our treasury secretary. Ralph Goodale, the longest serving member of parliament of any of the people on this page, is our equivalent to your Homeland Security secretary. He comes from Regina, Saskatchewan. And this gentleman, Harjit Sajjan, very interesting background, turban Sikh, obviously. There are 4 Sikhs in our cabinet of 30 people. Sajjan was the head of the Vancouver Police anti-gang unit for 11 years, joined the Canadian Army, and then did 3 tours of duty, 1 in Bosnia and 2 in Afghanistan as an enlisted man, became very much an intelligence specialist, ran for Parliament for the first time ever in this last election on October the 19th. By the way, there were a lot of Canadians that got quite irritated that our election campaign lasted 70 days, which was rather longer than it recently had, and they clearly haven't been paying too much attention to how long your campaigns last. Anyway, our Environment and Climate Change Minister is Catherine McKenna, a trade lawyer from Ottawa. The portfolio was the Environment Ministry, reflective of the focus that the new government has on climate change. They actually changed the name of the Department of Government. The others, all important and consequential people. This gentleman here, Marc Garneau, is our Transportation Minister. And of note, I suppose, is his expertise in transportation. He was Canada's first astronaut and participated in NASA for a couple of decades of his career. The Prime Minister, as soon as he was elected, or as soon as he was sworn to office, which was on the 4th of November, our transitions are comparatively short. Election 19 October, transition day 4th of November. He, within days, got on a plane and went to Turkey for the G20 summit, where he spent some time with President Obama. And he went directly from Turkey to Manila, the Philippines, for the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Leaders Conference, where he spent some more time with President Obama. He came back to Ottawa briefly and met with our Canadian premiers, the equivalent of governors. They were all there to talk about climate change. This was 10 days before the Prime Minister was going off to Paris, to COP21 in Paris. And interestingly, almost all of our premiers went with him to Paris, as did leaders of non-governmental organizations, business leaders. Canada, rather remarkably, had the largest delegation of any country at COP21, but the fact is everybody bought in. They were all there. Delivery on commitments very much cascades to the provinces in terms of constitutional responsibility, and so it was important that they be there. After that conference, he went off to London to see the Queen, who is our head of state, and then with the Queen, although not on the same plane, went to Malta for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, an organization that has more than 50 leaders of countries like India and Pakistan and South Africa and Kenya and Canada and Australia and New Zealand and the United Kingdom. Of course, he didn't see President Obama there because you folks decided in 1776 that you didn't want any more part of that. Anyway, he went from the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting directly to Paris to the COP21 conference, came back for the speech from the throne. I'm giving you a mini civics lesson here. This is Canada's Governor General, the Queen's representative in Canada, a very eminent academic and lawyer, David Johnston. There's the Prime Minister there. The speech from the throne in Canada is like your State of the Union address. And so the Prime Minister, sworn to office on the 4th of November, travels to Turkey, to the Philippines, back to Ottawa, to London, to Malta, to Paris, and is back in Ottawa, and literally 1 month after he's sworn in, his State of the Union speech is given. It was a pretty active month, let me tell you. And after Parliament resumes, because in Canada, every member of the cabinet, I should have said this before, when the cabinet was sworn, it had 15 men and 15 women, which is the first time that's happened in Canada, and indeed that kind of gender parity doesn't exist in very many countries in the world. He actually was challenged by a kind of ornery journalist who, he was making something of the fact that he'd appointed a cabinet with true equality, and he was challenged by a journalist who said, why this fixation on equality? And he said, well, because it's 2015. And that pretty much ended that discussion. There have been no more challenges on the issue of gender equality in the Canadian cabinet. So Parliament resumes. Our members of the cabinet sit in Parliament. They represent a district, and so they have all the responsibilities of your members of the House of Representatives. They also have to appear every day that Parliament sits in the House of Commons and answer questions on anything that pertains to their portfolio. In the case of the Prime Minister, that's anything at all. And to do it in both official languages, it requires some dexterity to be a political leader in Canada, and as it does in your country. I've got a lot of admiration for ours, as I do for yours. This is at Davos, where he seemed to be the star. So Bono was there, and Leo DiCaprio was there, and people didn't want selfies this year with Bono or Leo DiCaprio. They wanted them, it seemed, with the Prime Minister. He's here with Sheryl Sandberg and Melinda Gates on a panel about feminism. And Davos, the World Economic Forum, has been tweeting ever since it ended 5 weeks ago about the Prime Minister's comments that he's a feminist, and he's raising his 3 children. He and his wife are raising their 3 children to be feminists, 2 of whom are boys. This, I guess, is path-breaking in many respects. He then is at Davos. He meets with Fareed Zakaria, your CNN journalist. To Trudeau, we decided to present a positive vision, and he's very sunny in his outlook. In Republican primary terms, rather more like John Kasich and rather less like Donald Trump, I suppose. In any event, Zakaria thought that Trudeau was a star, maybe the star, at... this is not something that we Canadians are especially accustomed to. I was saying to David Yepson earlier that we're kind of modest and humble, at least we try to be. It is our shtick, maybe. Trudeau isn't trying to be anything other than modest and humble, but that the world is fascinated by Trudeau is something rather new for us, and is, as they were by his father, frankly. His father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, was Prime Minister from 1968 to 84, with a brief 9-month exception. He made a number of campaign commitments. He did during the, he and his party, during the campaign, to strengthen relations with the United States, which frankly, almost every candidate for office pledges to do. It kind of implies that there's a problem. There wasn't really, but every candidate wants to make them better, as best as they can possibly be, and I'll come back to that. He pledged to complete the Canada-EU Free Trade Agreement, which was negotiated in all of its details by the previous government, the outgoing government. We think it gives us some particular advantages. He proposed real leadership in contrast to what he perceived as certain lethargy on the part of the previous government on greenhouse gas emission mitigation and action to combat. He proposed to bring 25,000 refugees Syrian refugees to Canada. Canada takes 250,000 legal immigrants per year, about 0.8% of our population. The US takes 750,000 legal immigrants, I think, proportion to population, because yours is 9 times the size of ours. We take way more legal immigrants. We don't have much illegal immigration, however. It's not the easiest place to get to, Canada, and for the most part, you folks aren't streaming north across our border. So we can perhaps take a few more refugees, and we pledged to bring 25,000, and that commitment slipped a little bit in terms of the deadline date. It slipped from December 31st to February 29th, and indeed the final 2 of the 25,000 arrived on February 27th. Now, we're not stopping, but we're going to work at integrating all of those folks, and we can get into that too if you want. He also proposed to transform Canada's role in the anti-ISIL coalition without in any way dropping out of it, and we'll come back to that too. A little bit on the economic relationship. This map isn't very clear. We are by far the United States' best customer in the world. More than $2 billion of trade, goods and services, crosses our border every day. Our trade is virtually in balance as a result of 2015. We had a surplus. You might have noticed that the price, considerable surplus, maybe $100 billion. The price of oil having fallen, a chunk of our exports to the United States being represented by oil, we're getting less money for that oil, which has the corresponding impact on the trade balance. But in the case of Illinois, Illinois' exports to Canada were more than $20 billion. Clearly a considerable amount, and more than Illinois sells to any country in the world. And you might have expected that for border states, we would logically and naturally be the best customer, but in fact, we're the best customer for 36 US states, including Florida and southeastern US states. And this is using US Department of Commerce data. More than 9 million jobs, or nearly 9 million jobs, in the US and millions more in Canada depend on this trade relationship. So it's important that the relationship be good and that it be the best it possibly can be, and that the border be as fluid as possible without in any way compromising anybody's security, because a lot of people rely for their income on the amount of the volumes of trade that go back and forth. This is just Illinois. Illinois sells more to Canada than to its next 5 country customers put together. And the population of these 5 countries, Mexico, China, Germany, Japan, and Australia, is 1.75 billion people. And again, there are only 35 million of us, making us, per capita, really good customers of the United States, or of Illinois, rather. And when you think about it, in Carbondale, folks might not have Canada top of mind every instant, but you're about 780 miles from Carbondale to Toronto. Our commercial, financial, and manufacturing capital. Population a little bit more than 6 million, so a little bit bigger than Missouri, as it were, in terms of the total population of the area. You're closer to Toronto, a foreign non-capital, than you are to your own capital, but by about 50 miles. And you're 200 miles closer to Toronto than you are to New York, the United States' financial and commercial capital. So it's probably understandable that so much trade happens. And we, just breaking it down to the level of the district, the 15th congressional district that you're in now, Representative Shimkus' district, it is Representative Shimkus, is it not? Or is it Representative Dole? Bost, okay. Well, so I gave you the wrong district. Forgive me. The numbers are comparable. They're not quite as strong, but there's probably a couple $2 billion in exports from Representative Bost's district, and they're probably in the same order, 10 to 12,000 folks whose jobs depend on trade with Canada. Lots of Canadian investment in Illinois, 326 companies employing more than 43,000 folks, and it's a reciprocal thing. Lots of investment from the state of Illinois in my country, suggesting that this really works well for everybody. Among the commitments that the government made when they were in the opposition were to introduce a middle-class tax cut and to pay for it by raising taxes on, if you like, the 1%. And so legislation was actually introduced in January to provide a 1.5% tax cut for the middle class, however that's precisely defined, and to increase taxes. And that will pass, and it'll become law, and Canada will be a little bit of a path breaker in that regard. And one of the reasons that we can do this is that, we're in budgetary balance. The government inherited a surplus, actually. Canada's had a national government surplus for the last 2 years, and before the recession, 2008 to 12 or 13, we had a national government surplus for 11 straight years. My country is reasonably well run. Doesn't matter which stripe of government is in office, whether it's liberal or conservative. Those are the only two stripes we've had so far. The situation is, as you can see, the United States being the comparative, is relatively good. In terms of debt load, because the government committed as well that they were prepared to run a deficit. Canada led the G7, you know which countries those are, for 10 years. This is average per year growth at 1.9%. The US had 1.8% growth on average over the time. The recession didn't hit Canada as badly for several reasons. No banks failed. There weren't housing foreclosures, et cetera, reasons I can go into. But we have a debt load that's less than half on a percentage of GDP basis than the United States, and that causes the government to say there's probably some flexibility here to make major investments in infrastructure, because our infrastructure is decaying, frankly, like some of it is in this country, and our growth is not robust. We're not in recession, but commodity prices are down, not just for oil, but for minerals and for forestry products and so on. They think that it's appropriate to goose the economy a little bit. So they've talked about a deficit during the campaign. They said $10 billion, which would be about 3% of government spending. It could be as high this year as $30 billion. In other words, they're going to make some really transformative investments up front on the assumption that those will pay benefits and that tax revenues will grow and they can ramp back the deficit spending. I talked about trade. We signed this free trade agreement with Europe. We also signed the one with the TPP, as the United States did. The free trade agreement with Europe actually was delivered yesterday in terms of its final legal, the technical term is scrubbed version, and there were some changes made to it, particularly on investment protection. But we're excited about this because we're going to have one of these with Europe for a couple of years, maybe more, ahead of the United States, and Canada will be the only G7 country with guaranteed preferential market access to North America and to the EU. And then, of course, when TPP comes into effect, should it come into effect, also to the developed countries of the Pacific. We think that makes Canada a pretty attractive platform from which to export to the world. Shifting quickly to GHGs, to the environment, we've got challenges, big ones, like the United States does. We've got some advantages as well. This is both a curse and a blessing. There's not much room for improvement. Already 79% of our electricity generation is non-emitting. 60% of that comes from hydroelectric power, 15% or so from nuclear, 3 or 4% from renewables. The share of renewables is growing each year. We're major investors in that. But the gap between 79 and 100 is not nearly as big as it is for the United States, which is right on the G20 average at 31. You've got lots of scope to grow as you increase non-emitting electricity generation. We have to do it in other sectors of the economy. On hydro, we are the world's third largest producer of hydroelectric power after China and Brazil, and we could actually double probably that volume, that magnitude of hydroelectric generation. Of course, we'll do it only if we can sell it to you, as in you're going to be the principal consumers, and we can help you meet your GHG reductions targets. But of course, every transmission line that would cross the border invites or incites some angst, some concern, and has to be permitted. It's not just KXL pipelines that have to be permitted by the president. Any piece of infrastructure crossing the border has to be permitted by the U.S. administration. Even though your population is 9 times ours, your GHG emissions from coal are more than 30 times from coal-fired electricity generation ours. It's another way of making the point that I made earlier. We've made the same commitments at Copenhagen in December of 2009, and again at Paris in December of 2015. They were identical at Copenhagen. They're very similar to one another at Paris. Neither of us is going to meet our 2009 commitments, and the difference perhaps between the new government in Canada and its predecessor is that the new government is very passionately committed to meet its commitments that it made at Paris, which again isn't going to be easy, but the Prime Minister is meeting all of the premiers today in Vancouver, talking about a carbon tax. Some of them aren't quite so keen, but we can institute a national carbon tax if we want and apply it even in provinces that aren't keen on it. Some of the provinces are quite keen, and some of them already have it. British Columbia has it, and it's in many respects a model. It's actually quite popular. It was introduced in 2008, and the government committed that every dollar that it collected from the carbon tax would return in terms of other tax cuts, as in there would be no net enhancement of British Columbia government revenues, and they've honored that. They've more than honored it, actually, and as a result, the tax, which was unpopular when it was introduced, seems to have become popular. What seems to be unpopular is the notion that governments are going to enrich themselves by taxing carbon and then using that money for potentially other purposes. Syrian refugees, the Prime Minister became quite personally engaged. The first plane arrived on the 11th of December from Jordan in Toronto at Pearson International Airport, and here's the Prime Minister greeting a young girl who got off the plane that night. Happy to talk about refugees or other things. This is a media conference that took place just 2 weeks ago. Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, Defense Minister, Foreign Aid Minister, at which the announcement was made that we would indeed end our participation in the bombing portion of the anti-ISIL campaign, and we would do so on the 22nd of March. Canada has flown thousands of sorties and dropped all kinds of bombs, where we think ISIL is horrid, evil, and we're not backing off the effort. What we're going to do is massively increase, more than double the number of Canadian forces posted to Iraq for purposes of training, particularly the Kurds, working with them to up their game somewhat. We'll continue to do mid-air refueling. We'll continue to do reconnaissance. We'll continue to send lots of aid. We'll continue to take refugees, but we're not going to engage any longer in bombing. The Prime Minister thinks that other countries have a comparative advantage when it comes to doing bombing and that we can do other things, and we're going to do other things. I'm going to stop there, and we've done about a half an hour. Still got half an hour, and maybe have given you some food for thought in terms of questions, whether on things that I raised or anything else having to do with Canada or the Canada-US relationship that might be on your minds. So
thank you.
Fire away.
I'll open with the first question. What is the status of the pipeline, of the Keystone Pipeline?
Well, the Prime Minister and the President talked about it in their conversation the day after the election and before he'd even become Prime Minister. And then they talked about it again 3 days after he became Prime Minister, when the President announced that he was not going to give the permit, the approval. The Prime Minister expressed disappointment. He officially supports the pipeline, as does his party. If you polled every member of his party, you wouldn't necessarily get that outcome. But nonetheless, the official party position is support for the pipeline. It never was a government project, it's important to emphasize. It's a private sector project that the government put its weight behind in terms of people like me going out and advocating in support of it, which I was happy to do. I firmly believe that the Keystone Pipeline, XL Pipeline, makes all kinds of sense, and I could spend the next 30 minutes telling you why I think that. But essentially, we backed off. So the President said no. Obviously, therefore, it's not going to happen in the next year. Secretary Clinton, who had sort of been a supporter, or was thought to have been a supporter, has said no. Senator Sanders says no, no, no. And I think every Republican says yes, sort of yes mildly to yes enthusiastically. And we'll see. The company, meanwhile, is suing the United States government under NAFTA Chapter 11, asserting that that the U.S. changed the rules. I happen to have been one of Canada's negotiators of NAFTA Chapter 11, which was something that your country wanted. We didn't. At least we didn't ask for it. And now not everybody in your country seems to like it. We've lost a few times to U.S. companies under NAFTA Chapter 11, and the U.S. hasn't lost. Some people seem to think that TransCanada Pipelines has a pretty good case, but it's a case that's going to take 6 years, 5, 6, 7 years to be adjudicated. So I don't think, short of a Republican presidential victory and a resubmitted application that a president could then approve, I don't think you're going to have to deal with this for some time.
Okay. Before we turn to questions, I see they were handing out the cards to get your feedback. Those are important to us as part of our metrics that we have to show the university and the IDHE. So please take a moment to fill out those feedback cards.
You must tell me how I did.
Okay,
thank you.
Also, I just want to mention before we all scatter at the end, on Tuesday, we're doing a briefing at the Varsity Theater at 7 p.m. on our polling, which you've noticed we've been releasing some public opinion polling. All of us will be there to give you a little briefing on what we're finding about public opinion in Illinois. On Tuesday the 22nd, we've got Dr. Neota Curvin coming in to talk about the state of the American worker, that ongoing series that discusses essentially the diminishing middle class in the United States. So you're all invited to that. On the 23rd, we got Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack, who will be here 7 o'clock over in the Student Center Auditorium. I don't know, and I have been meaning to ask John, when was the last time we had a sitting cabinet officer come to SA? Okay. Anyway, I've known Governor Vilsack for a long time, and he's graciously agreed to be here to talk. And with that, I'll switch back to the questions because I want to open it up. Any student have questions?
So it's all Iowa all the time at the Paul Simon. Okay.
Well, we do have a little Hawkeye flavor here.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
What aspect of the Canadian-American relationship would your government like to see the most improvement in? What's the biggest concern?
Probably security cooperation, recognizing that the border is truly important to the United States as well as it is to Canada, and finding ways to harmonize procedures that will make it the most efficient that it can possibly be. It's costly to individuals who go back and forth for tourism or work or who sell things or buy things to have delays. It functions reasonably well. We after 9/11, both governments, after 9/11 and a few years, both governments began to invest a fair bit of energy. The Prime Minister Harper in 2011, twice at the White House with President Obama, launched things that are called the Beyond the Border Initiative and the Regulatory Cooperation Council. This is pretty granular. It's not very sexy, but it's important. And it's the sort of thing that people like me, officials, work on and burrow down and invest ourselves in trying to see marginal incremental improvements in. And there have been some. But there's always some vulnerability. You do get people who are prepared at the drop of a hat in your country to talk about throwing up barriers, whether literally walls or otherwise. The assertion is made, Senator Clinton made the assertion more than once until she was reined in, that the 9/11 terrorists came from Canada. Indeed, not one of them had ever set foot in Canada. They were all admitted to your country through your immigration procedures and not flying via Toronto or Montreal. But that's the sort of thing that Fox News gets ramped up about and is prepared to say, oh, well, you better seal the border or take measures that would involve substantial additional scrutiny that would effectively shut down the border or cause such delays. It's important to us, and we would like we would like for Americans to regard it as being important to them that we keep making progress on this issue. More? Yes, sir.
You mentioned the dollar, your $1.70. What has been its height or closeness to the U.S. dollar? And I know that would impact your economy as it does ours.
It impacts my personal well-being. I'm paid in Canadian dollars, and I live in the United States market. The $1.07, I think, was the most recent high about 3.5 years ago. A year and a half ago, it was at par, and it was at par pretty much for about a year and a half. And then as oil prices started to fall, it's kind of out of whack, as in, it tracks commodity prices, it floats. We don't manipulate our dollar in the way that some countries are accused of manipulating their currencies. We're not deliberately trying to gain some kind of advantage for Canadian exporters here. It floats. And it's investors, it's people in New York and London and so on who determine fundamentally what the value of the Canadian dollar is. It's now hovering around 70 cents, and that is prospectively good for people who are exporting. It's not so good for the 3.5 million Canadians that spend time in Florida every year. I once had a conversation with former presidential candidate Jeb Bush at the Mackinac Conference on Mackinac Island in Michigan, who said to me when I introduced myself, he said, "There are 3.5 million of your compatriots who come to my state every year." And I said, "Governor, you're well briefed. That's exactly the case." He said, "But they're kind of cheap." And the point being that we don't spend as much as Germans or French or Brits or whatever. And all I could say in response is, but we stay much longer. So anyway, a lot of Canadians in some senses single-handedly revived the Florida real estate market after the financial crisis, and perhaps likewise the Arizona real estate market, by buying up, yes, cheap property, and obviously somebody lost on the deal, but it took huge volumes of properties off of the market and made it possible for a generalized improvement in the real estate sector as a result of this overhang having been addressed.
I remember being down in Florida, they had some enclaves, Canadian enclaves. People, that's when I first heard about Canadians go down to Florida.
Yeah, and Quebecers tend to go to the Atlantic coast, and Ontarians tend to go to the Gulf Coast, and so you get people cheering for the Toronto Maple Leafs, pointless though that might be, on the Gulf Coast, and for the Montreal Canadiens on the Atlantic coast. You had a question, ma'am.
Yeah, I'm wondering what will be done about Enbridge Line 5 under the Straits?
Well, good question. Enbridge thinks that nothing has to be done about Enbridge Line 5. They monitor it constantly. It's been there for a long time. They monitor it from the inside of the pipeline, for that matter. Everybody acknowledges that it would be catastrophic if there were to be a breach, but I won't say we're conflicted on this, but bear in mind that the oil that goes through that pipeline is going to Canada. It's from Canada, through the United States, to Canada, to refineries in Sarnia, Ontario. And certainly if it were to be breached, that would be catastrophic in every respect. If people were to insist that it be closed down and there was no replacement, that too could be catastrophic from the point of view of our own economy. One of our responses to the failure to secure a permit for Keystone XL pipeline is that we're proposing, it's one thing to propose, another thing to make happen, but we're proposing to build pipelines across Canada, which will carry oil to eastern Canada, which currently still relies heavily on imports of oil, which I suppose hypothetically could make Line 5 redundant. So maybe you should be hoping that we build our pipelines, that we take our oil through a strictly Canadian route, not running it through the United States, and maybe in that scenario, Line 5 would be less important. Yes, sir.
There's been a lot of talk recently about the diversion of water out of the Great Lakes, particularly around Waukesha, Wisconsin.
Right.
And given that the Great Lakes are jointly, quote, managed by the premiers as well as the governors, what's the position of Canada dealing with that diversion? And there's some policy, I believe, regarding diversion.
Well, coincidentally, I was in the government of Ontario from 2000 to 2006, responsible for our international relations, and therefore was very much a part of the negotiations towards the compact. This is between Canada, not Canada, but Ontario, Quebec, and 8 states bordering on the Great Lakes. The compact was arrived at in 2005, was ratified by the US Congress in 2007. It doesn't have to be ratified by Canada. We don't literally have a say, as in we would ultimately have a say, but in the first instance on the Waukesha diversion proposition, it is the 8 US governments, 8 US state governments that vote, and it has to be unanimous. Michigan has made it pretty clear, I think, that they oppose it. So hypothetically, the current proposal brought by Waukesha, supported by the state of Wisconsin, would fail. A lot of people think that it's too ambitious anyway, that they're seeking more than what they need, and the assumption on the part of some is that if the proposal were to be rejected, they would come back with a more modest one, which might be able to command support, unless, of course, Michigan still says no. The concept of diversion, the compact is against large-scale diversions of water. So there can't be a pipeline built to Arizona or to Los Angeles from the Great Lakes. The concept of water to communities in so-called straddling counties, and Waukesha is a straddling county, was provided for in the compact. So the legal basis exists if the approval is forthcoming for that to happen. To go beyond Waukesha, as in west of Waukesha, there would be no legal basis for, and therefore you could say that it doesn't create a precedent in the sense that the straddling counties can be identified, they're known already, and they constitute the maximum volume of additional demand for water from the Great Lakes. Obviously, it's a precious resource. 49.7% of the land that fronts on the Great Lakes is in my home province of Ontario, and 50.3% is in the 8 US states. So we literally are equally responsible for both ensuring the quality and the quantity of that water. Canada's all in terms of not favoring large-scale diversions. Waukesha, I don't want to trivialize it, but doesn't constitute by any stretch of the imagination a large-scale diversion and would be consistent with the compact, but might not happen, at least in terms of their current proposal, because Michigan in particular has made it pretty clear. I think my own sense is that, obviously Wisconsin's in favor, my own sense is that Illinois probably won't oppose. They're proximate to Wisconsin. They probably would think that a jurisdiction with, this much frontage on the Great Lakes, as in 1% or less, should not be dictating to a proximate state that has 8.7% of the frontage on the Great Lakes. And I don't know what New York and Pennsylvania and Ohio think, but it doesn't matter if Michigan says no.
They do drain water down through Chicago, down to
Indeed they do, and the largest single diversion, which obviously is grandfathered by the compact, is the Chicago diversion from decades ago that was arguably built so as to send Chicago's sewage to St. Louis instead of onto the waterfront of Lake Michigan. That's how some people have characterized it to me. Anyway, it's protected. That flow will continue, but it can't be increased. More? Yes. Did you have one? Because you haven't asked one. Oh, thank you. Okay.
Are the Canadian people as concerned or alarmed, I should say, about the recent anti-missile testing that North Korea has conducted, as Americans are?
Yes.
And then how has the government forcefully expressed that concern to the UN?
Well, we condemn it in statements. The Prime Minister issued one. The Prime Minister, we don't have diplomatic relations with North Korea, so we don't have a lot of leverage over them. Indeed, it's not clear that China, which does have diplomatic relations and more with North Korea, has much leverage over them either, at least not clear that they have leverage that they're really prepared to exercise. So they're something of a rogue state, obviously, behaving totally irresponsibly. We, the United States, the sensible world, we're all in agreement, but we haven't proven terribly successful, have we, at stopping this behavior. They seem to like to tweak the nose of the superpower and everybody else routinely, and that kind of juvenile behavior, of course, only happens on the part of political leadership in North Korea and nowhere else in the rest of the world, does it? The more. Yes,
I
ma'am.
have a comment. We were in Canada a few years ago, and we were able to go through U.S. Customs in your airport. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you, in the sense that you've got this capacity at, I think, 7 Canadian airports, might be 8. We'd like it to be at every Canadian airport that had flights to the U.S. That's not terribly realistic. It's a high cost. I mean, you're talking about posting U.S. Customs and Border Protection officers to Canada at a much higher cost because you've got to subsidize their living costs and so on. They're like diplomats. Much higher cost than if they worked at St. Louis Lambert and went home at night. There are some people that think that we should be posting officers at U.S. airports likewise. The problem is that there are only about 7 or 8 airports from which Canadians or Americans fly back to the United States or fly to Canada. Canadians fly to the United States from 7 or 8 airports. There are all kinds of airports that you fly to Canada from, many more big cities. And we couldn't begin to place people in that many jurisdictions. But it's very efficient, keep it up. Keep them posted.
We've got time for about one more. I want to make sure. Do we have any students that have any questions? Just want to make sure I'm not.
Yes, sir.
I can do it. You say like your main role here is a lot of economic relations in that way, but like, are there other things that you deal with other than that, and like, what type of stuff outside of economic relations would you deal with?
Well, advocacy on pipelines or on irritants that arise. Pipelines can be a bit of an irritant. We've got a few. They probably affect 5% of the economic relationship, so 95% is fine. Last year, and for the previous 6 years, we had one in the agricultural sector called country of origin labeling, a piece of legislation that was introduced in the Farm Bill of 2008 that Secretary Vilsack seemed to quite like, but which 3 times was found by the World Trade Organization to breach the United States' trade obligations to Canada and Mexico. And notwithstanding that we kept winning, nothing happened. And in a very uncharacteristic Canadian move, we said, finally, enough. We're going to retaliate by placing tariffs on U.S. agricultural exports, including potentially some hundreds of millions of dollars of Illinois agricultural exports to Canada, unless you act. And in the omnibus appropriations bill on the 18th of December, I think it was, this got repealed. The omnibus appropriations had nothing to do with country of origin labeling, but it served as a vehicle to deal with the problem. We have one this year on softwood lumber. This is a perennial irritant that gets addressed for a period of time. The deals expire. The most recent one expired in October, whereby we're different countries. We organize ourselves differently, even if we are best friends and closest allies and think alike and support one another abroad. Your major softwood lumber producers, Weyerhaeuser, Northwest U.S., Washington State, Oregon, Southeast, Georgia, Alabama, claim that we have a different regime for tithing the production of lumber. Most of your lumber is produced not on federal government-owned land. Most of ours is produced on, derives from, and we have it's called Crown land, and there's a tax that we place, but American interests assert that there's a subsidy in there. And so literally tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars of legal fees were incurred by both governments leading up to a 2006 deal. We kept winning in the World Trade Organization, but again, it didn't matter. And so finally we capitulated, and what we did was to put a tax on our exports. which seems bizarre, but you were going to tax our imports, and meaning you'd keep the tax. And we said, if the objective here is to increase the price for the consumer, so as to reduce competition, then there's more than one way to increase the price. You can place an import tax, we can place an export tax, we get to keep the export tax. So we did that. It expired in 2011, and it was renewed for 4 years, and it expired again in October, and this is going to be a knock 'em down, drag 'em out fight this year. No real interests in my 3 states, maybe a little bit in Wisconsin, but Wisconsin and Illinois, certainly not Illinois. I mean, you're not a major softwood lumber producer. Corn, yes, softwood lumber, no. So there may be allies here to be found. Allies meaning members of Congress. So last week I was in Washington meeting with members of Congress. Not either Mr. Bost or Mr. Shimkus, but a couple from Missouri, Jason Smith from nearby in Missouri, Reed Ribble and Mark Pocan from Wisconsin, and some from Illinois, on issues generally, and just showing the flag and reminding them that we're here and we love you and you should love us, and we're not China. We don't compete with the United States on the cost of labor or on health or environmental or labor standards. And so if you've got some inclination to take action, target your action. Don't sideswipe Canada. It's the special relationship that I was talking about. So there's trade promotion, investment attraction, and there's advocacy, which is all over the lot along the lines that I've just described.
Steve, did you have a quick question?
It'll probably take a while.
Okay.
The questions are much quicker than the answers in reality. So
Well, he'll be here for a minute. So
okay, we can talk.
feel that. I want to thank all of you for being here. Let's give Dr. Norton a hand.
Thank you. Thank you.